The parking attendant noticed something no one else did, and whispered the words that could save, or end, the crime boss. Aaliyah Monroe thought tonight would be just another shift, another night of being invisible while directing the luxury cars of the city's most dangerous men. But as Victor Hale approached his vehicle, she saw the subtle tell in his driver's stance, the hand not on the door but hovering over a remote detonator. In a world where one wrong move is fatal, Aaliyah decides to break her silence. She presses a valet ticket into Victor's hand, her eyes meeting his for the first time as she whispers, "Your driver took the money, Mr. Hale. Right now, you're just the collateral." Before we see if Victor heeds her warning, if you're hooked on this tale of a ghost who became the most important person in the room, do us a solid and subscribe. It's the best way to make sure you catch every twist in this deadly game. The air in the P4 level of the Hale Plaza garage didn't just smell like exhaust, it tasted like it. It was a thick metallic soup of stale cigarette smoke, expensive gasoline, and the damp, earthy scent of concrete that never saw the sun. For most of the city's elite, this subterranean labyrinth was a non-place, a necessary transit zone between their armored luxury and the glass towers where they played God. They moved through it with their eyes fixed on their gold watches or encrypted phones, never noticing the woman standing in the amber glow of the flickering fluorescent lights. Aaliyah Monroe liked it that way. She stood by pillar B12, her posture relaxed but her mind operating like a high-definition recorder. Her reflective neon yellow vest was her invisibility cloak. In the hierarchy of the Hale Empire, a parking attendant was less than a person. She was a piece of the infrastructure, as unremarkable as a fire extinguisher or a speed bump. This nobody status was Aaliyah's greatest asset. For 3 years, she had been a ghost in a high-vis vest, and ghosts heard everything. Tonight the garage felt different. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was heavy like the air before a thunderstorm. Aaliyah adjusted her clipboard, her dark brown skin catching the jaundiced light of the overhead bulbs. She checked her watch, 11:42 p.m. On the VIP ramp, a black Mercedes S-Class pulled into its designated spot. It was a beautiful machine, silent and predatory, but Aaliyah's focus wasn't on the car. It was on Marcus Reed, the man who stepped out of the driver's seat. Marcus was the definition of forgettable on purpose. He was clean-cut, mid-30s, wearing a suit that was expensive but lacked any personal flair. He was the perfect shadow for a man like Victor Hale, but tonight the shadow was acting independently. Usually Marcus would stay in the car, engine idling, until the private elevator from the penthouse signaled its descent. Tonight, Marcus was out of the car before the engine had even finished ticking. Aaliyah shifted her weight, stepping deeper into the gloom behind the pillar. She watched Marcus through the gap between 2 concrete supports. He was packing, a tight 3-step walk that betrayed a spike in cortisol. His gloved hand kept ghosting over his right ear, adjusting an earpiece that wasn't part of the standard Hale security frequency. "He's nervous," Aaliyah thought, her heart beginning a slow, steady thud against her ribs. And Marcus Reed doesn't get nervous. She let her gaze drift past Marcus, scanning the rest of the P4 level. That was when she saw it. Tucked into the darkest corner of the contractor-only zone sat a nondescript grey SUV. It was a common enough vehicle, but its presence here was a violation. That spot was reserved for maintenance vans. The SUV's engine was off, but the windows were rolled down just a crack, not enough to see faces, but enough for the faint, acrid smell of cheap tobacco to drift toward Aaliyah's sensitive nose. There were at least 3 men inside. She could see the faint blue glow of a tactical tablet reflected in the tinted glass. They were waiting. The ding of the private elevator echoed through the garage, a sharp metallic sound that seemed to vibrate through the concrete floor. The elevator doors slid open, and Victor Hale stepped out. Even in the dim, ugly light of the garage, Victor looked like a king. He was a man of immense physical presence, tall, broad-shouldered, with a jawline that looked like it had been carved from the very granite of the building he owned. He wore a black wool coat over a tailored suit, the collar turned up against a chill he shouldn't be able to feel down here. His grey eyes were fixed on a document in his hand, his thumb scrolling with the bored efficiency of a man who assumed the world would always wait for him. "Ready, Marcus." Victor's voice was a deep baritone that filled the space. It was the voice of a man used to being heard, yet never having to shout. "Ready, sir," Marcus replied. His voice was smooth, too smooth. He walked around to the rear passenger door, his hand reaching for the handle. "The route is clear. The bridge is open." Aaliyah felt a jolt of electricity shoot down her spine. The bridge. Marcus knew the bridge was closed for construction tonight. She'd seen the city notices on her way into her shift. It was a lie, a small tactical lie to ensure Victor didn't question a change in the route. Aaliyah looked at the grey SUV. The passenger door creaked open just an inch. She saw the glint of matte black metal, the barrel of a suppressed submachine gun. In that moment the world slowed down. Aaliyah saw the hierarchy of her life clearly. There was Victor Hale, the man who owned the city. There was Marcus Reed, the man who was about to sell the city's soul for a payout. And then there was her, the woman who nobody saw, the woman who could stay in the shadows and watch the king fall or step into the line of fire and lose everything. She thought of her grandmother's voice. Aaliyah, most people go through life with their eyes closed. If you're the only one with them open, you have a responsibility to the truth. Aaliyah stepped out from behind the pillar. Her heavy work boots clicked sharply on the concrete, a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the tense silence. "Mr. Hale," she called out. Victor stopped. His hand was inches from the car door. He turned his head slowly, his brow furrowing in genuine confusion. It was the look of a man who had encountered a glitch in his reality. He looked at her neon yellow vest, then finally he looked at her face. "The valet log, sir," Aaliyah said, her voice steady despite the roar of blood in her ears. She began walking toward him, her clipboard held tight against her chest like a shield. "Not now, girl," Marcus snapped, his eyes flashing with a predatory warning. "Move along, we're on a schedule." Aaliyah ignored him. She kept her eyes locked on Victor's steel-grey gaze. She was only 5 feet away now. She could smell the expensive sandalwood of his cologne. "It's about the collateral on this vehicle, Mr. Hale," she said, stressing the word. "There's a discrepancy in the security ticket. I need you to verify the signature." She thrust the clipboard toward him. Marcus moved to intercept her, his face a mask of sudden, violent intent. "I said back off." "Marcus," Victor said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of a mountain. He held up a hand, stopping his driver in his tracks. Victor looked at Aaliyah. He saw the sweat on her upper lip. He saw the way her fingers were trembling against the clipboard. But mostly he saw her eyes. They weren't the eyes of a subordinate. They were the eyes of a witness. He took the clipboard. Aaliyah had scrawled the words in thick black marker on the back of a valet slip. "Your driver took the money. The grey SUV is a hit squad. Do not get in the car." Victor's expression didn't change. He was a man who had spent 30 years hiding his thoughts from the most dangerous people on the planet. But Aaliyah saw the tiny, microscopic tightening of his pupils. He didn't look at Marcus. He didn't look at the SUV. "I see," Victor said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous vibration. "It seems there is an issue with the paperwork." He looked at Marcus. The driver was already reaching into his jacket. "I think I left my briefcase in the lobby, Marcus," Victor said. "The girl will help me find it." "Sir, we really should leave," Marcus said, his voice losing its professional polish. He stepped closer, his body language shifting from servant to captor. "The package needs to be delivered." "Run," Aaliyah whispered, her voice barely audible. Victor didn't run. He grabbed Aaliyah's arm, not to push her away but to pull her with him. "Now," Marcus screamed. The grey SUV's doors flew open, and the first spray of gunfire shredded the air where Aaliyah had been standing a second before. The world dissolved into a cacophony of screeching rubber and the rhythmic, terrifying thud-thud-thud of suppressed gunfire. The sound wasn't like the movies. It was mechanical and cold, like a heavy stapler punching through sheets of metal. Aaliyah felt a violent jerk as Victor's hand clamped onto her shoulder, his strength surprising and absolute. He didn't just lead her. He redirected her momentum, pivoting his massive frame to keep himself between her and the SUV as they dove behind the thick, square concrete base of Pillar B12. The air around them filled with the dust of pulverized concrete. Victor's armored Mercedes, the very vehicle that was supposed to be his sanctuary, hissed as a stray round punctured a cooling line. "Stay down," Victor barked. His voice was no longer that of a corporate titan. It was the voice of a general in a foxhole. He reached into the small of his back, drawing a sleek, compact semi-automatic that had been hidden beneath the vent of his tailored coat. Aaliyah's heart was drumming against her ribs so hard she thought it might break skin. Her reflective vest, once her shield of invisibility, now felt like a neon target. She fumbled with the Velcro straps at her sides, her fingers slick with sweat, and ripped the vest off, kicking the bright yellow fabric away into the center of the driving lane. Good, Victor muttered, his grey eyes tracking the movement of the SUV. Smart. Marcus Reed was no longer hiding behind the facade of a loyal driver. He stood in the open, crouched behind the sedan's door, his face a mask of sweating desperation. He hadn't expected the nobody to speak. He hadn't expected his payday to walk away from the door. Victor, Marcus's voice echoed, distorted by the garage's acoustics. Don't make this harder than it has to be. You were never going to make it through the year anyway. This is just business. Business ended when you touched the door, Marcus. Victor shouted back, his voice steady as he checked his sights. Aaliyah looked at the pillar they were leaning against. It was solid, but the enforcers were already fan out. One was moving toward the VIP elevator, cutting off the most obvious escape route. The other was flanking to the left, heading for the row of luxury SUVs that offered a direct line of sight to their position. We can't stay here, Aaliyah whispered, her voice trembling but clear. They're going to pin us. There's a generator room behind the main HVAC unit. It has a vent that leads to the P5 sublevel. They won't know the layout. Victor looked at her, his steel-grey eyes searching hers for a flicker of doubt. He saw none. P5, that level hasn't been used for years, it's a dead end. Not for me, Aaliyah said, gripping her clipboard, her only weapon, her only piece of herself left. I spent 6 months mapping the service tunnels when the elevators were being retrofitted. There's a freight lift that bypasses the security grid, but we have to move now. Victor nodded once. On 3, I'll provide the noise, you lead. He didn't wait. On 3, Victor leaned out and fired 3 rapid, disciplined shots toward the SUV. The heavy rounds smashed into the engine block and the windshield, forcing the men inside to duck. It was the noise he promised, a violent distraction that gave Aaliyah the window she needed. Go. Aaliyah bolted. She didn't run in a straight line, she stayed low, darting between the pillars and the parked cars. She heard the asterisk zip of a bullet passing her ear, a sound like a hornet on fire. She didn't look back. She heard Victor's heavy footfalls behind her, the sound of a man who refused to be collateral. They reached the massive, humming HVAC unit, a wall of spinning fans and vibrating metal. Aaliyah slid into the narrow gap between the unit and the concrete wall, a space barely wide enough for a person. Victor followed, his broad shoulders scraping against the metal with a harsh, screeching sound. Here, she hissed, pointing to a heavy steel grate at the base of the wall. The grate was held in place by 4 rusted bolts. Aaliyah reached into her pocket and pulled out a heavy-duty multi-tool she carried for minor garage repairs. Her hands were shaking, the adrenaline making her movements jerky, but she jammed the screwdriver head into the first bolt and twisted with everything she had. Move, Victor said, stepping in. He didn't use a tool. He braced his back against the HVAC unit, placed a heavy boot against the center of the grate and kicked. Clang! The bolts sheared off under the raw force of his leg. The grate collapsed inward, falling 10 feet down into the darkness of a service shaft. Aaliyah didn't hesitate. She slid into the hole, her boots hitting a pile of discarded rags and dust at the bottom. Victor followed a second later, landing with a heavy thud that puffed up a cloud of ancient soot. Above them, they heard the sound of Marcus and the enforcers reaching the HVAC unit. Where are they? Marcus screamed. They couldn't have just vanished. Aaliyah put a finger to her lips, her eyes wide in the dark. They were in a narrow concrete tunnel, barely 5 feet high, filled with the smell of damp earth and the distant, rhythmic thumping of the building's heart. Victor stood up as much as he could, his head nearly touching the ceiling. He looked at the woman beside him. In the dim light filtering down from the hole, she looked like a phantom, covered in dust, her hair mussed, her eyes glowing with a terrifying intelligence. You're a ghost, Aaliyah Monroe, Victor whispered, his voice carrying a sudden, strange note of respect. I've been a ghost for 3 years, Mr. Hale, she whispered back, turning toward the darkness of the tunnel. But tonight I think the ghosts are the only ones who are going to make it out alive. Follow me, stay close, don't touch the pipes, they're live steam. As they began their crawl into the bowels of the building, Aaliyah realized the shift in the air. The power dynamic had dissolved. Upstairs, Victor Hale was a man who moved markets. Down here in the damp and the dark, he was just a passenger. And for the first time in his life, he was being driven by someone he hadn't even bothered to look at an hour ago. The hunt was far from over. Marcus Reed was a desperate man, and desperate men didn't just walk away from a payday this large. But as Aaliyah led the crime boss deeper into the concrete maze, she felt a cold, sharp sense of purpose. She wasn't just a parking attendant anymore, she was the one holding the map. The air in the P5 sublevel was different from the floors above. It was heavier, stagnant, and chilled by the deep foundation of the city. While the upper tiers of the garage were polished and maintained for the comfort of the elite, P5 was a forgotten crypt. The lighting here was sparse, amber-tinted industrial lamps that hummed with a low, dying frequency, casting shadows so long and distorted they looked like ink spills across the concrete. Aaliyah led Victor out of the service vent and into a narrow corridor lined with rusted conduits. She moved with a silent, rhythmic grace, her senses heightened by the claustrophobia of the space. Behind her, Victor moved like a caged panther. He was too large for these narrow arteries, his tailored suit now smudged with grease and limestone dust, yet he didn't complain. He kept his pistol low and ready, his eyes scanning the darkness with the practiced discipline of a man who had survived a dozen wars before this one. This level was abandoned after the flood of 22, Aaliyah whispered, her voice barely a breath against the hum of the pipes. The structural integrity was cleared, but the city never bothered to fix the lighting or the pumps. Most of the cars down here are ghosts, unclaimed assets, insurance write-offs, things people wanted to disappear. Victor looked around at the rows of dusty, ancient vehicles. They sat like silent sentinels in the gloom, an old Cadillac with its tires rotted away, a luxury sedan covered in a thick shroud of grey silt. It was a graveyard of broken dreams and discarded secrets. "It's a perfect place for an execution," Victor noted, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Marcus knew this garage. He knew I'd never come down here. He probably planned to leave my body in one of these trunks for a decade." Aaliyah stopped at the edge of a wide, open bay. "He didn't plan for me," she said, looking back at him. Her eyes were sharp, reflecting the amber light. "He didn't realize that the help spends their breaks exploring the places the bosses are too afraid to go." She led him toward the far end of the bay, where a set of heavy, accordion-style metal gates stood. This was the freight lift, a massive iron-caged beast designed to move industrial equipment. It was old, manually operated, and completely independent of the digital security grid that Marcus likely controlled. "If we can get this moving, it drops straight to the loading docks on the south side of the complex," Aaliyah explained, reaching for the heavy iron handle. "From there it's a 50-yard dash to the street." "And your car?" Victor asked. "An old hatchback parked in the employee lot. It's rusted, it's loud, and it's the last thing they'll expect to see you in." As Aaliyah gripped the handle, a sound echoed through the bay, a rhythmic, metallic asterisk clack 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 asterisk. It was the sound of someone dragging a metal pipe across the concrete floor. "Victor," Marcus's voice boomed, but it was different now. The professional veneer was gone. It was replaced by a jagged, hysterical edge. "I know you're down here. I know the girl led you to the basement. Do you think she can save you? She's a ghost, Victor. She doesn't exist. You're dying for a shadow." Aaliyah froze. The sound was coming from the ramp. They hadn't followed them through the vent, they had driven down. "He's trying to draw us out," Victor whispered, stepping in front of Aaliyah. He raised his pistol, his thumb clicking the safety off with a terrifying finality. "He's losing his mind because the invisible variable broke his perfect equation." The headlights of the grey SUV suddenly cut through the darkness, two blinding white eyes that swept across the graveyard of cars. The engine growled, a low, predatory snarl that vibrated in Aaliyah's chest. "Hide," Victor commanded. "No," Aaliyah said, her eyes fixing on a row of old industrial oil drums near the lift. "If we hide, they'll just sweep the floor until they find us. We need to divide them." She looked at Victor, her mind racing through the geography of the floor. "The SUV can't maneuver in the tight rows of the north section. The pillars are too close together. If you can draw their fire toward the center, I can get to the control room and dump the fire suppression foam. It'll blind them and kill their traction." Victor stared at her. "You want me to be the bait?" "I want you to be the boss," Aaliyah said. "Make them look at you, they won't even notice I'm gone." A small, grim smile touched Victor's lips. It was the first time Aaliyah had seen him look truly impressed. "Go," he said. "Make them regret coming into your kingdom." Aaliyah slipped away into the shadows of the rusted Cadillac, just as Marcus's SUV accelerated, the tires chirping on the slick concrete. Victor stepped out into the center of the bay, standing tall in the amber light. He looked like a statue of an ancient god, immovable and defiant. Marcus, Victor shouted, his voice echoing like thunder. You want the collateral, come and collect. The SUV roared, its lights focusing on Victor. Behind the steering wheel, Aaliyah saw Marcus's face, twisted, red and frantic. He didn't see the woman in the dark uniform slipping through the shadows behind him. He didn't see the nobody reaching for the emergency override lever. Aaliyah reached the glass-walled control booth. Her heart was a frantic bird in her chest, but her hands were steady. She gripped the lever, her eyes fixed on the SUV as it surged toward Victor. See me now, she whispered. She slammed the lever down. The response was instantaneous and violent. From the rusted overhead pipes, a torrential deluge of chemical fire suppression foam erupted, turning the air into a blinding white blizzard. It wasn't a mist, it was a thick, viscous blanket that coated the world in seconds. The grey SUV, mid-acceleration, lost all purchase. The tires spun uselessly on the slick, soapy concrete, the engine roaring in a frustrated scream as the vehicle fishtailed wildly, slamming into a concrete pillar with a bone-jarring crunch. Aaliyah stayed low in the booth, watching through the glass as the world outside turned into a chaotic blur of white foam and strobe-light muzzle flashes. Marcus's men were panicking, firing blindly into the suds. I can't see anything," one of the enforcers screamed. Victor, however, was a man of the shadows. He had already moved. The moment the foam hit, he had memorized his path. He wasn't running, he was stalking. Aaliyah watched a silhouette move through the white haze, precise, deadly, and silent. A single shot rang out, followed by the heavy thud of a body hitting the floor. Then another. Inside the SUV, Marcus was frantically kicking at the driver's side door, which had been jammed shut by the impact with the pillar. He was trapped in a cage of his own making, surrounded by a white void that had stripped him of his tactical advantage. Aaliyah scrambled out of the booth. The foam was already ankle-deep, cold and stinging against her skin. She moved toward the freight lift, her boots slipping, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had to get the gates open. She had to finish the escape. "Victor," she called out, her voice muffled by the thick air. By the lift, his voice barked back, surprisingly close. He emerged from the foam like a vengeful spirit, his black coat now matted with white chemical suds. He looked at Aaliyah, and for a split second, the coldness in his eyes softened into something resembling concern. He grabbed her arm, steadying her as she struggled with the heavy iron accordion gate. "The lock is rusted shut," Aaliyah hissed, pulling at the chain. The foam got into the gears. Victor stepped up beside her. He didn't waste time with the handle. He jammed the muzzle of his pistol into the heavy padlock and fired. The metal shattered, and with a grunt of primal effort he shoved the gates open. The iron groaned and shrieked, protesting years of neglect, but it gave way. Behind them, the SUV's passenger door finally flew open. Marcus stumbled out, coughing, his face a mask of chemical foam and blood from the crash. He held his weapon with trembling hands, wiping his eyes frantically. "Hale," he screamed, his voice breaking. "You think you're better than me. You think you're more than just a man. I worked for you for a decade. I knew your coffee order, your dry cleaner, the name of every woman you threw away. I was the one who made you look untouchable." Victor paused at the edge of the lift. He looked back at Marcus, his expression one of profound, icy pity. "You were the one who drove the car, Marcus," Victor said, his voice carrying over the hiss of the dying foam pipes. "But you never learned how to see the road. You were so busy looking at my seat that you never noticed the woman standing right in front of you." Victor stepped into the lift and pulled the inner gate shut. He looked at Aaliyah, who was already reaching for the manual pulley system. "Drop us," Victor commanded. Aaliyah pulled the lever. With a violent lurch and the scream of unoiled cables, the freight lift began its slow, heavy descent into the pitch-black heart of the loading docks. Above them, Marcus reached the edge of the shaft, firing a desperate, final volley into the darkness, the sparks of the bullets hitting the iron cage like dying stars. But they were already gone. They've made it out of the garage, but the hunt is just beginning. If you're on the edge of your seat wondering how a parking attendant outsmarts a professional hit squad, hit subscribe. The chase is about to get even more intense. Down in the darkness of the descent, the silence returned, broken only by the rhythmic clack-clack-clack of the lift hitting the guide rails. Aaliyah leaned against the vibrating metal wall, her strength finally failing her. She sank to the floor, her chest heaving. Victor remained standing, his hand still on the gate, staring up into the shaft. He stayed that way for a long time before he finally looked down at her. He reached out a hand, not a command but an offering. "You're shaking," he observed. "I'm a parking attendant, Mr. Hale," Aaliyah whispered, her voice cracking. "I'm not supposed to be in gunfights." "No," Victor said, his voice unusually soft. "You're a woman who saved a man who didn't deserve it. That makes you something entirely different." The lift hit the bottom with a heavy thud. The doors to the loading dock stood before them, the last gate to the world outside. The loading dock was a cavern of concrete and cold air, smelling of diesel fumes and wet cardboard. It was the backside of the glamorous Hale Plaza, the part the public never saw, where the garbage was hauled out and the supplies were hauled in. The freight lift doors rattled open, revealing a space that felt miles away from the polished marble of the penthouse or the chaotic violence of the garage above. Aaliyah stepped out first, her boots splashing into a shallow puddle of oily water. The silence here was heavy, broken only by the distant hum of the city waking up outside the rolling metal gates. "My car is in the employee lot," Aaliyah whispered, pointing toward a chain-link fence at the far end of the dock. "It's distinct, you can't miss it." Victor followed her, his breathing ragged. The adrenaline that had fueled his sprint through the garage was beginning to ebb, replaced by the dull throb of bruises he hadn't noticed he'd acquired. He looked at his surroundings with new eyes. He owned this building. He signed the checks for the maintenance of these docks, yet he had never set foot here. It was a foreign country within his own borders. They reached the fence. Aaliyah keyed a padlock on a pedestrian gate and they slipped through into the open air. The night sky was a bruised purple, heavy with rain clouds. The employee lot was a sad collection of vehicles, dented sedans, trucks with mismatched doors and scooters chained to posts. "That one," Aaliyah said, nodding toward a faded red hatchback that had clearly seen better decades. Rust ate at the wheel wells, and the bumper was held on by duct tape and prayer. Victor stared at it. It was the kind of car he wouldn't have let park within a mile of his hotel. "It runs," Aaliyah said defensively, seeing his expression, "and the heater works sometimes." "It's the most beautiful car I've ever seen," Victor said, and he meant it. They got in. The interior smelled of synthetic pine air freshener and old coffee. Aaliyah shoved the key into the ignition, and the engine coughed to life with a noisy, rattling protest. Victor sat in the passenger seat, his knees pressed against the dashboard. He looked at himself in the side mirror, his face smeared with grease and white fire suppression foam, his $5,000 suit ruined. He looked like a wreck, he looked like a survivor. "We need to get to the safe zone in the chaotic district," Victor said, his voice regaining some of its command. "I have a safe house on 4th and Main. If we can get there, I can access my offshore accounts. I can buy an army." Aaliyah gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. She didn't put the car in gear yet. She stared out the windshield at the rolling gate that led to the street. "You're shaking again," Victor noted, his voice quiet. "I've never killed anyone," Aaliyah whispered. She wasn't looking at him. She was replaying the sound of the bullets hitting the darkness in the shaft. "I park cars, Mr. Hale. I listen to podcasts. I pay my rent. Tonight I broke every rule I have." Victor turned in the cramped seat, the cheap fabric creaking. "You didn't break them, Aaliyah. You rewrote them. Marcus thought he was the author of this story. He thought he could write me out and write himself a check. You took the pen out of his hand." Aaliyah turned to look at him. In the dim light of the dashboard, the distance between them, the gap between the billionaire and the attendant, felt non-existent. They were just two people breathing the same recycled air. "Why do you watch?" Victor asked. "You said you watch everyone. Why?" "Because when you're invisible, people show you who they really are," Aaliyah said softly. "They think I'm part of the background, so they don't hide their secrets. I saw Marcus stealing from the petty cash 3 months ago. I saw him taking calls on a burner phone. I saw the way he looked at you when your back was turned, like he was measuring you for a coffin. And you never said anything." "Who would have listened?" Aaliyah asked, a sad smile touching her lips. "If I had walked up to you yesterday and told you your driver was a traitor, you would have had security throw me out. You had to be in the trunk before you could see the truth." Victor looked away, shame burning in his chest. She was right. He had been blind, arrogant, and comfortable. "I'm listening now," Victor said. Aaliyah shifted the car into gear. "Good, because we have a problem." She pointed to the exit gate. Through the chain links they could see the street. It wasn't empty. A black sedan was parked across the driveway, its lights off, blocking the exit. They anticipated the freight lift, Victor realized, his hand going to his weapon. Marcus called ahead. He has a backup team. He doesn't know we're in this car, Aaliyah said, her mind working fast. He's looking for a government plate or a luxury vehicle. He's looking for you. He's not looking for a rusted Honda with a baby on board sticker. Aaliyah, Victor warned, seeing the look in her eyes. That car is blocking the only exit. If we pull up, they'll see us. We're not going to pull up, Aaliyah said, revving the engine until it whined. We're going to create another exit. She threw the car into reverse, spinning the wheel. The hatchback swung around, facing not the gate, but the chain-link fence where the employee lot met the alleyway. Put your head down, boss, Aaliyah said. She slammed her foot on the gas. The little car surged forward, groaning under the strain. Victor braced himself against the dashboard. They hit the fence at 40 miles an hour. Metal shrieked, glass cracked, and the world tumbled into a blur of sparks and tearing steel. The fence gave way, wrapping around the hood like a spiderweb before snapping. The car bucked violently, hopping the curb and landing hard in the alleyway with a bone-jarring crunch of suspension. Aaliyah didn't let up. She corrected the skid, tires spinning on the wet cobblestones, and shot down the alleyway away from the black sedan. Behind them, shouts erupted. An engine roared to life. They saw us, Victor shouted, looking back. We have a tail. Welcome to the night shift, Mr. Hale, Aaliyah said, her eyes locked on the road ahead. Hold on. The impact with the chain-link fence wasn't like the movies. It was a violent, jarring collision that felt like driving into a wall of steel wool. The rusted red hatchback groaned in protest, the front bumper shearing off with a screech of tearing metal that sounded agonizingly like a scream. The windshield spiderwebbed instantly on the passenger side, turning Victor Hale's view of the world into a fractured mosaic of wet asphalt and sparks. Head down, Aaliyah screamed, wrestling the steering wheel as the car bucked over the curb. They landed hard in the back alleyway, the suspension bottoming out with a bone-rattling thud that jarred Victor's teeth. For a split second the engine sputtered, choking on the sudden violence, and the silence in the cab was terrified and absolute. Then Aaliyah stomped on the gas pedal. The little four-cylinder engine roared, not with power but with desperate effort, and the tires found purchase on the slick, rain-soaked cobblestones. Are you hit? Aaliyah yelled, her eyes glued to the rearview mirror. Victor shook his head, brushing shards of safety glass from his lap. I'm fine, keep moving. He turned in his seat, looking back through the shattered rear window. The scene at the employee lot exit was a blur of chaos. Through the gap in the fence they had just created, he saw the sleek, predatory silhouette of the black Audi that had been blocking the gate. Its headlights flared to life, blinding white beams cutting through the gloom. Its engine revved, a deep, turbocharged growl that promised violence. They're coming, Victor said, his voice grim, and that car has twice the horsepower we do. Horsepower doesn't matter in the web, Aaliyah said, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. She shifted gears aggressively, the transmission whining as she pushed the hatchback to 40 miles an hour in a space designed for 10. The web, Victor asked, bracing himself against the dashboard as she took a sharp left turn that nearly put them on two wheels. The warehouse district, she explained, her voice tight. It was built for horse carts in the 1800s. Narrow lanes, sharp angles, dead ends. If you don't know the map, you don't drive, you crash. Behind them, the Audi roared into the alley. It was a machine built for the Autobahn, wide and low and fast. But here, on the uneven stones and narrow corridors, its size was a liability. Victor watched as the pursuing driver struggled to keep the wide sedan from scraping the brick walls on either side. They're gaining on the straightaway, Victor shouted. He raised his pistol, aiming through the shattered rear window. It was a futile gesture. The hatchback was bouncing so violently over the potholes that aiming was impossible. He squeezed off 2 rounds, the shots cracking loudly in the confined space, but the bullets sparked harmlessly off the Audi's reinforced grille. Stop shooting, Aaliyah ordered. You're just telling them exactly where we are, let me drive. She killed the headlights. The world outside the car plunged into darkness. Victor grabbed the oh shit handle above the door. You can't see. I don't need to see, Aaliyah whispered. I know the rhythm. She counted under her breath. 1, 2, 3. She yanked the wheel hard to the right. The car drifted, tires screaming, sliding into a narrow gap between 2 abandoned textile factories. It was a blind turn into pitch blackness. If there had been a dumpster, a wall, or a homeless encampment in the way, they would have been dead instantly. But there was nothing, just empty, wet pavement. The Audi, blinded by the sudden disappearance of its quarry's taillights, overshot the turn. Victor heard the screech of expensive brakes locking up, followed by the sickening crunch of metal hitting brick as the sedan sideswiped the corner building. Aaliyah didn't celebrate. She kept the lights off, navigating the maze by the ambient orange glow of the distant street lamps reflecting off the wet roofs. She took 3 more turns, left, right, then a sharp left again, looping them through the bowels of the district until the roar of the Audi faded into the distance. Only then did she turn the headlights back on. They were yellow and dim, one of them flickering like a dying candle, but they illuminated the road ahead. Victor exhaled, a long, ragged breath that seemed to deflate his entire frame. He slumped back into the cheap fabric seat, feeling the bruises from the fight in the garage begin to throb. He looked at the woman driving. She was trembling. Her hands were shaking so hard the steering wheel vibrated, but her foot on the gas was steady as stone. "You drive like a getaway pilot," Victor murmured. "I drive like a girl who grew up avoiding potholes that could swallow a bus," she corrected, her voice shaky. "We're clear of the district. We need to decide where we're going." "Head north," Victor said immediately, his command voice returning by habit. "4th and Main. I have a safe house there, penthouse level, secure access. It has a medical kit and a hardline to my Swiss accounts." Aaliyah didn't turn the wheel. She kept heading south toward the river. "Turn the car around, Aaliyah," Victor said, his tone sharpening. "We need resources, we need weapons, 4th and Main." "No," Aaliyah said. The word was soft, but it landed like a hammer. Victor stared at her. "Excuse me." "Think, Victor," she said, using his first name without the honorific for the first time. "Who drove you to 4th and Main last month? Who waited in the lobby while you met with the councilman? Who has the security codes to the garage because you didn't want to get out of the car to punch them in?" Victor froze. The memory hit him like a physical blow. Marcus. Marcus had been there. Marcus knew the location. Marcus knew the codes. "He'll be waiting there," Aaliyah continued, glancing at him. "Or he'll have rigged it just like the car. If we go to your world, your safe houses, your penthouses, your clubs, we die. Marcus spent 10 years memorizing your map. We can't use your map anymore." Victor looked out the window. The gleaming skyscrapers of the financial district were receding in the rearview mirror, replaced by the jagged, industrial silhouette of the south side. This was the part of the city the news helicopters avoided. The streetlights here were broken. The roads were cracked. It was a place of survival, not luxury. "So where are we going?" Victor asked, his voice quiet, stripped of its arrogance. "The Stacks," Aaliyah said. "My neighborhood. The police don't come down there unless they have a SWAT team, and the traffic cameras have been broken since the riots in 19. It's a black hole." "And Marcus?" "Marcus is a man who wears a $1,000 suit and thinks he owns the world," Aaliyah said, a grim smile touching her lips. "He wouldn't know how to find a specific apartment in the Stacks if he had a GPS. To men like him, to men like *U*, places like the Stacks are just scenery. You look right past them." Victor fell silent. He looked at his hands. They were stained with grease and blood. He realized with a jarring clarity that Aaliyah was right. He had looked past this part of the city for his entire life. He had looked past her. And now that invisibility was the only shield he had left. The hatchback rattled as they crossed the rusted iron bridge that separated the city center from the south side. Below them, the river churned, black and oily. "I've never been to the Stacks," Victor admitted. "I know," Aaliyah said. She reached over and locked her door manually. "Welcome to the real city, Mr. Hale." They drove deeper into the grid. The buildings grew taller and denser, massive brick tenements that loomed over the street like canyon walls. Graffiti covered every reachable surface, layers of tags and murals that told the history of the neighborhood in neon paint. People were out on the stoops despite the hour and the rain, watching the car pass with guarded eyes. Aaliyah slowed down. She pulled the battered car into a narrow alleyway behind a towering complex that looked like a fortress. She killed the engine. The silence that rushed into the car was heavy. The adrenaline of the chase began to fade, replaced by a crushing exhaustion. "We walk from here," Aaliyah said, unbuckling her seatbelt. "My building is the 3rd one in, top floor, no elevator. And keep your head down. If anyone asks, you're my uncle from out of town who got into a bar fight." Victor looked at the grim surroundings, then at the woman who had navigated them through the fire. He realized he wasn't the boss anymore. He was just a passenger in her world. He opened the door and stepped out into the rain. "Lead the way, Aaliyah." The climb up the stairwell of the stacks felt longer than the high-speed chase through the warehouse district. The air was thick with the scent of boiled cabbage, lemon-scented floor cleaner, and the metallic tang of damp concrete. There was no elevator. The shaft had been boarded up with plywood years ago, covered now in layers of vibrant, angry graffiti. Every flight of stairs felt like a mountain to Victor, whose lungs burned and whose shoulder throbbed where the seatbelt had bitten into him during the crash. Aaliyah moved 2 steps ahead, her pace steady despite the exhaustion etched into the lines of her face. She didn't look back to see if he was keeping up. She knew he had no choice. "Third door on the left," she whispered as they reached the 8th floor landing. The lighting here was a single, naked bulb that hummed with a dying frequency, casting long, jittery shadows against the peeling yellow paint of the walls. Aaliyah's apartment was a fortress built on a budget. She bypassed a hidden sensor near the floorboards, then produced a ring of keys, working through 3 separate heavy-duty deadbolts with practiced speed. When she finally pushed the door open, Victor stepped into a world that was the complete antithesis of his marble and glass penthouse. It was a single, cramped room, but it was meticulously organized. Books were stacked floor to ceiling on reclaimed wooden crates, volumes on civil engineering, urban design, and classical history. A small kitchenette occupied one corner, scrubbed spotless. The air smelled of lavender and old paper, a sudden, jarring island of peace in a city that was trying to kill them. "Lock the door," Aaliyah commanded, dropping her keys on a small side table. Victor engaged the bolts, the heavy asterisk thud of the steel sliding into the frame, providing the first real sense of safety he'd felt all night. He leaned his back against the wood, sliding down until he hit the floor, his long legs stretching across the small rug. He was a titan of industry, a man whose name was whispered in boardrooms across 3 continents, and he was currently sitting on linoleum that cost $4 a yard. Aaliyah didn't offer him a drink or a place to sleep. She went straight to a medical kit tucked under the sink. She returned and knelt in front of him, her movements clinical and efficient. "Take off the coat," she said. Victor obeyed, his expensive wool coat, now a rag of grease and soot, hitting the floor with a dull weight. Aaliyah began to clean the gash on his forehead with an antiseptic wipe. The sting was sharp, but Victor didn't flinch. He watched her. In the soft light of a small desk lamp, she didn't look like a parking attendant. She looked like a master of her own small, perfect universe. "You really live here?" Victor asked, his voice raspy. "It's mine," she said simply. "I don't owe anyone for it. I don't have to look over my shoulder when I'm inside these walls." She paused, her hand hovering near his temple. "Or at least I didn't until tonight." "I'm sorry," Victor said. He surprised himself with the words. He didn't apologize to subordinates. He didn't apologize to anyone. But as he looked at the books on her shelves, asterisk the geometry of cities asterisk, advanced structural mechanics asterisk, he realized he wasn't looking at a subordinate. "You're an engineer," he noted, nodding toward the crates. "I'm a student who ran out of money," Aaliyah corrected, moving her attention to the bruising on his shoulder. 2 years left. I park cars to pay for the credits I can afford. I want to build things that last, Mr. Hale, things that help people move instead of things that keep them trapped." "You have a talent for navigation," Victor murmured, "and for tactical suppression." "I have a talent for noticing what people want to hide," she countered. She sat back on her heels, her dark eyes searching his. "Marcus didn't just want you dead, did he? He was talking about a trade. He called you Collateral." Victor's face hardened, the grey in his eyes turning to flint. "The Russians, they've wanted the Southside port terminal for years. I wouldn't sell. It's the gateway to the city's logistics. Marcus realized that if I disappeared, the board would panic. He'd be the one holding the keys to the kingdom, ready to sign the papers in exchange for a seat at their table." "He was measuring you for a coffin while he was opening your door," Aaliyah said, a chill running through her. Suddenly a faint sound broke the silence of the room, a rhythmic, high-pitched asterisk chirp, chirp, chirp. Aaliyah froze. "What is that?" Victor frowned, reaching into his ruined jacket. He pulled out his phone. The screen was a spiderweb of dead pixels. He checked his pockets. Nothing. Then his eyes fell on his left wrist. The Patek Philippe. The red light on the side of the casing wasn't just blinking, it was glowing steady. "My watch," Victor whispered, a cold dread pooling in his stomach. "It's a biometric link. If my heart rate exceeds a certain threshold for more than 10 minutes, it broadcasts a high-frequency distress signal to my security team." "Your security team?" Aaliyah asked, her voice rising. "The one Marcus used to lead." Victor's face went pale. Marcus has the master receiver. He doesn't need to track the car. He just needs to track the pulse in my wrist. Take it off, throw it out the window. Aaliyah scrambled to her feet, but the sound of a heavy engine idling in the street below had already reached them. She dove for the window, peeling back a corner of the blinds. Her heart plummeted. 2 black SUVs were idling at the curb, their lights off, blocking the alleyway exit. Men in tactical gear were already spilling out, moving with the silent, practiced efficiency of wolves. "They're here," Aaliyah whispered, her voice trembling for the first time. "He followed the signal straight to my front door." Victor ripped the watch from his wrist and slammed it onto the floor, crushing the sapphire glass under the heel of his boot, but the damage was done. The beacon had served its purpose. "Aaliyah, the fire escape," Victor said, grabbing his pistol. "Go, now, I'll hold them at the door." Aaliyah looked at the heavy deadbolts she had trusted. She looked at her books, her life, her sanctuary. Then she looked at the man who had brought the storm to her doorstep. "The fire escape is a trap," she said, her mind snapping back into focus. "They'll have shooters in the alley. If we go down, we're fish in a barrel." "Then what?" Aaliyah looked up at the ceiling. "The roof. The stacks are connected by a series of old catwalks. If we can get to the water tower, we can cross over to the north building." A heavy, thunderous asterisk thud shook the door. Someone was using a ram. "Go," Aaliyah hissed, grabbing a heavy-duty flashlight and a wrench from her toolkit. The door groaned under a second strike. Splinters of wood flew into the room. "Victor," Aaliyah yelled, pointing to the ceiling hatch. Victor shoved her upward, helping her scramble into the dark crawl space of the attic. As he reached up to pull himself after her, the front door finally gave way with a sickening crack. Marcus Reed stepped into the room, his suppressed submachine gun leading the way. He looked around the small, lavender-scented apartment with a sneer of pure contempt. He looked at the crushed watch on the floor, then at the open hatch in the ceiling. "You really picked a hell of a place to die, Victor," Marcus shouted into the rafters. "From a penthouse to a slum, how the mighty have fallen." Above them, in the dark, Aaliyah gripped Victor's hand. She wasn't an invisible girl in a vest anymore. She was the only thing standing between the king and his grave. "Don't breathe," she whispered. The attic was a claustrophobic crawl space of fiberglass insulation and century-old dust that tasted like copper and neglect. Above them, the tin roof pinged under the light drizzle of the morning rain. Below them, the floorboards vibrated with the heavy, rhythmic thud of Marcus's men dismantling Aaliyah's life. Every shattered dish and overturned bookshelf echoed upward, a violent soundtrack to the end of her sanctuary. "They're moving toward the back," Victor breathed, his mouth inches from Aaliyah's ear. He was pressed flat against the joists, his large frame barely fitting in the narrow gap. The heat radiating from him was intense, the smell of gunpowder and expensive sandalwood now clashing with the musty rot of the attic. Aaliyah didn't answer. She was watching a sliver of light through the roof vent. She knew the geography of the stacks better than Marcus ever would. To him, this was a slum, a chaotic mess of brick and decay. To her, it was a structural puzzle. She knew that the north building and the south building were separated by a 10-foot gap, but linked by the industrial water main pipes that fed the cooling towers. "The roof hatch is jammed from the outside," Aaliyah whispered, her voice a ghost of a sound. "We have to go through the service bulkhead. It'll drop us right behind the water tower." "And if they're already on the roof?" Victor asked, checking the slide on his pistol. He had 3 rounds left, maybe 4. "Then we find out if you can fly," she replied grimly. She led the way, crawling on her stomach over the wooden slats. She reached a small, rusted iron door, the bulkhead, and gripped the handle. It was cold and slick with condensation. She looked back at Victor, whose face was a mask of sweat and grim determination. With a sharp, synchronized heave, they pushed the door open and rolled out onto the roof. The cold air hit them like a physical blow. The south side was laid out beneath them in a sea of grey and rust, the morning fog clinging to the streets like a shroud. 20 feet away, the massive iron water tower loomed like a 3-legged giant. There, Marcus's voice erupted from the stairwell exit. He hadn't gone for the fire escape. He had anticipated the roof. Marcus stepped out onto the gravel-covered surface, his suppressed weapon raised. He looked like a man possessed, his hair disheveled, his eyes bloodshot, the professional driver replaced by a cornered rat with a gun. "End of the road, Victor," Marcus shouted over the wind. "No more alleys, no more magic tricks from the help." Victor shoved Aaliyah behind the base of the water tower. just as a spray of silent bullets chewed into the iron legs, sending sparks dancing into the fog. "You're making a mistake, Marcus," Victor roared back, leaning out to fire a single, disciplined shot. The bullet struck the brickwork near Marcus's head, forcing him to dive for cover behind a ventilation unit. "The Russians won't honor your deal once I'm dead. You're a loose end, nothing more." "I'll take my chances with them over being your shadow for another decade," Marcus screamed. He signaled to two enforcers who were emerging from the hatch. "Flank them. Get the girl. I want her alive for 5 minutes so she can watch him bleed." This is it, the final stand on the roof. To see if Aaliyah's gamble with a water tower and a flashlight pays off, and how this night changes both their lives forever, make sure you're subscribed. The conclusion is just moments away. Aaliyah felt a cold spike of terror, but her mind remained unnervingly clear. She looked at the water tower's main release valve, a massive, rusted wheel at the base of the tank. Then she looked at the catwalk, a narrow, rusted metal bridge that led to the north building. "Victor," she hissed, grabbing his arm. "The pressure in that tank is over 100 psi. If I can crack the bypass, the runoff will flood the roof. The gravel will turn into a landslide." "Do it," Victor said, moving to the edge of the tower to draw their fire. Aaliyah scrambled to the valve. It was stubborn, fused by years of grime and salt air. She jammed her heavy wrench into the spokes of the wheel and threw her entire body weight against it. The metal groaned. Her muscles screamed. "Come on," she grunted, her boots slipping on the wet gravel. "Cranky." The wheel turned an inch. A high-pitched hiss escaped from the pipe. "Cranked cracky." The seal broke. A violent, horizontal jet of freezing water exploded from the bypass, hitting the approaching enforcers with the force of a fire hose. The water swept the loose gravel across the roof like ball bearings. One enforcer lost his footing, his arms windmilling as he slid toward the edge of the roof. He vanished into the fog with a truncated scream. The second man was pinned against a vent by the sheer weight of the water. Marcus, further back, stayed upright, but the spray blinded him. He fired wildly, the muzzle flashes illuminating the mist in jagged strobes. "The catwalk now," Aaliyah yelled. They bolted. The metal bridge was slick and vibrating under the force of the wind. Below them was an 80-foot drop into a trash-filled alley. Aaliyah ran with the instinct of a cat, but Victor's weight made the rusted metal groan and sag. Halfway across, the catwalk buckled. A support bolt snapped with the sound of a rifle shot. Victor stumbled, his foot slipping through a gap in the floor. He caught himself on the railing, dangling over the abyss. "Victor," Aaliyah lunged back, grabbing the collar of his coat. From the roof of the south building, Marcus emerged from the spray, his face contorted in a mask of triumph. He leveled his gun at the dangling crime boss. "Collateral," Marcus sneered, his finger tightening on the trigger. Aaliyah didn't think. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the heavy-duty flashlight she'd grabbed from her apartment. She didn't throw it at Marcus. She threw it at the high-tension power line that fed the building's neon sign, hanging just feet above the catwalk. The metal flashlight struck the wire and the railing simultaneously. A blinding blue arc of electricity jumped. The surge didn't hit Victor. He was insulated by his heavy rubber-soled boots and the coat, but the flash blinded Marcus and sent a surge of feedback through the metal roof he was standing on. Marcus shrieked as the current bucked through him, sending his weapon flying over the edge. Aaliyah hauled Victor up with a strength she didn't know she possessed. They scrambled onto the roof of the north building just as the catwalk finally groaned and plummeted into the darkness below, severing the link between the two buildings. They lay on the cold roof, gasping for air, the rain washing the dust and soot from their faces. Across the gap they could see Marcus on his knees, his hands charred, staring at the empty space where his payday had vanished. Victor stood up slowly. He looked across the abyss at the man who had been his brother-in-arms for 10 years. He didn't fire his last bullet. He didn't have to. "It's over, Marcus," Victor said, his voice carrying clearly across the void. "The sun is coming up, and you're out of road." Victor turned to Aaliyah. He reached out and tucked a stray, wet curl behind her ear. His hand was steady now. "You're not a ghost, Aaliyah," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "You're the most real thing I've ever seen." Aaliyah leaned against the brick parapet, watching the first true light of dawn hit the glass towers of the city in the distance. The stacks were still in shadow, but the height gave her a new perspective. "I told you, Mr. Hale," she whispered. I'm just the one who watches the exits. Then show me the way out, Victor said, one last time. The morning sun over the city did not care about the blood spilled in the dark. It rose with a cold, indifferent beauty, painting the glass spires of the financial district in hues of pale gold and liquid pink. But down in the south side, the light felt different. It was a revealing glare that stripped away the mystery of the night, leaving behind only the jagged reality of broken glass, wet pavement, and the hollow shells of the buildings they had just traversed. Victor and Aaliyah descended the internal stairs of the north building in a silence that was no longer tense but weary. The adrenaline had finally retreated, leaving a heavy, bone-deep ache in its wake. When they finally stepped out of a side service door and onto the street level, the city was already beginning to stir. Somewhere in the distance, a garbage truck groaned. A few blocks away, a lone siren wailed, a herald of the chaos they had left behind on the roof. "My car is gone," Aaliyah noted, looking toward the alley where the rusted hatchback sat crushed under the weight of the collapsed fence and the debris of the pursuit. She didn't sound angry, just hollow. That car had been her only ticket out of the stacks, a $3,000 piece of independence now reduced to scrap metal. Victor looked at the wreckage, then back at her. He looked out of place standing on a south side sidewalk, a man in a torn, soot-stained tuxedo shirt, his charcoal trousers ruined, his face a map of cuts and dark bruises. Yet, as he stood there, the sun hitting his steel-grey eyes, he regained that effortless gravity that defined him. The car was a soldier, Aaliyah. It did its job, Victor said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted burner phone he'd recovered from his hidden attic stash. He tapped a few keys, sending a single signal to a frequency that Marcus didn't control. "The cavalry is 5 minutes out. My personal guard, the men who answer only to the blood seal, not to the office." They sat on the low brick wall of a defunct laundromat to wait. For the first time in 3 years, Aaliyah wasn't watching the garage. She wasn't tracking license plates or monitoring the subtle shifts in the great Victor Hale's posture. She was just sitting beside a man who, for the first time, was truly seeing her back. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice small against the growing roar of the city. "Marcus is alive. The Russians are still waiting. You go back to your tower and I go back to what? A door that's been kicked off its hinges." Victor turned his head toward her. The hardness in his jaw softened. "You think I'm going to let you walk back into that apartment? You think I'm going to let the woman who mapped my survival return to being a ghost?" "I don't have a place in your world, Mr. Hale," she said, looking at her oil-stained hands. "I'm a girl who parks cars and reads about bridges. I'm the help." "The help died in that garage, Aaliyah," Victor said, his voice a low, steady vibration. "And the man who walked out of the elevator last night died there too. I've spent 20 years building a fortress of glass, thinking I was safe because I was high up. I was wrong. Safety isn't about height. It's about knowing where the cracks are before the walls fall." A fleet of black SUVs, clean, silent and armored, rounded the corner, moving with a synchronized precision that commanded the street. They pulled to a stop in a perfect perimeter, and 6 men in tactical gear stepped out, their faces obscured by helmets. They didn't point weapons, they bowed their heads as Victor stood. One man stepped forward holding a heavy wool overcoat. "Sir, we've secured the plaza. Marcus Reed was apprehended by the secondary team 3 minutes ago. He's being detained." Victor took the coat but didn't put it on. Instead, he draped it over Aaliyah's shoulders. The heavy fabric was warm, smelling of cedar and safety. "The plaza is a crime scene," Victor said to his man. "And the penthouse is compromised. We're going to the Lake Estate. And I need a team sent to the stacks, North Building, Apartment 8C. I want every book, every sketchpad, and every personal item moved to the estate's library by noon. If a single page is torn, you'll answer to me." The guard blinked, confused, then nodded sharply. "Understood, sir." Victor turned back to Aaliyah. He didn't offer her a job title. He didn't offer her a salary. He simply held out his hand, the same hand that had gripped the railing over the abyss. "You told me you wanted to build things that last," Victor said. "I own half the transit infrastructure in this city. I own the ports, the bridges, and the tunnels. And right now, they're all rotting from the inside because the people running them don't know how to look at the shadows. I need a head of strategic security. I need someone who doesn't just see the exits but knows how to rebuild the entrance." Aaliyah looked at his hand, then at the black SUVs, then back at the crumbling brick walls of the neighborhood that had been her cage for so long. She thought about the mirror room, the yellow vest she had discarded, and the way Marcus had looked when he realized a nobody had unmade him. I'm not a ghost anymore, she said, more to herself than to him. No, Victor agreed, his eyes locking onto hers with a profound, unshakable respect. You're the architect of the new world, my world. Aaliyah took his hand. It was calloused, steady, and warm. She let him lead her toward the lead SUV. As the door opened, she took one last look at the stacks, the sunlight now fully illuminating the graffiti and the rust. It didn't look like a prison anymore. It looked like a map she had finally finished reading. As the convoy sped away, weaving through the morning traffic with the grace of a predator, Aaliyah leaned back into the leather seat. She wasn't watching the road. She was looking at Victor, who was already on his phone, dismantling the board of directors that had allowed Marcus to thrive. The king was back on his throne, but the throne had changed. It was no longer a seat of isolation. It was a partnership born in the dark, forged in the dirt, and cemented in the cold, clear light of day. Aaliyah Monroe, the girl in the yellow vest, was gone, and in her place was a woman who knew exactly how to navigate the city, because she was finally the one holding the keys.